Hi, everyone. My name is Rohan Rajpal, and I'm the co-founder of the Starting 11. I'm here today with our president, Ethan Huang, and we're both very excited to introduce you to our very special guest today, Kyle Yates. Kyle Yates is a featured correspondent and analyst for Fantasy Pros and a host of the Fantasy Pros football podcast, joining in January of 2020. Prior to this, he was a writer for the Fantasy Footballers. I encourage you all to check out his great work, which can be seen on the Fantasy Pros website, as well as the YouTube channel. I personally learned a lot about various prospects in this year's draft from some of his extensive draft preview videos. You can also follow his Twitter at KyleYNFL. Thanks for joining us today, Mr. Yates.
Absolutely, guys. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to talk some football with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're discussing the topic of good fantasy values. Our goal is to identify the best valued player from each of the first 11 rounds by average draft position. This is not to be confused with the best player from each round. For example, Christian McCaffrey's average draft position might be the first pick of the first round, but you could argue you'd get better value from picking Saquon Barkley, but the sixth pick. Of course, Saquon wouldn't be available on the sixth pick, so we use average draft position as a baseline. Today, it's all about paying less for more, and we'll assume a half PPR format in a 12-man league. With that in mind, who's your pick for round one, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. If we're looking at value guys, then I think Dalvin Cook is currently the guy that I would identify in that first round. And it's primarily because there have been question marks about whether or not he was going to hold out this season. There had been rumors as to the fact that he was going to hold out, and that I think affected his average draft position and caused some people who were doing mock drafts up to this point to kind of be out on selecting him with a higher draft pick. However, we know now that he has showed up to training camp and that he appears like he's going to be playing this season. So with that in mind, I think Cook is currently, at this moment, the highest value right now because he has the potential to finish as a top 3 fantasy running back this season, just based on the workload that he's going to get in Minnesota. And his ADP hasn't had a chance to rise based on the news that he is now in training camp. So Dalvin Cook currently is the RB6 right now. I think he can finish as a top 3 running back. Yeah,
absolutely. Could definitely see that happening. I might go with a more interesting pick for us right here. I think it's tough to get good value, necessarily a value pick with the top 4 options. I'm actually looking at the bottom of the round at Nick Chubb. Entering his third year, Nick Chubb is in peak condition, having never missed a game, and had the second most rush yards as well. He improved on almost every metric from his 2018 to 2019 season, despite being dreadful in the red zone last season. Yes, Kareem Hunt will have a sizable role and steal some receptions and touchdowns, but if the Browns get it going this year on offense and Chubb improves in the end zone even a little bit, there's no reason why he can't also be a top 3 running back. And keep in mind that we're with this Kevin Stefanski's run-happy offense. At the bottom of the round, I think you also can get pretty good value with Nick Chubb here. So I guess moving right on, who'd you go with for round 2, Kyle?
Yeah, if we're looking at round 2, as far as the ADP, the guy that is just jumping off the page to me is Kenyon Drake, currently going as the RB12 and half PPR ADP. That's a guy that I want on my rosters. And if I can get him as my RB2, then I'm ecstatic because I think his involvement in this Arizona offense is just going to be astounding. We saw what it translated to last season when he got traded from Miami to Arizona, and now a full offseason in this offense to adjust and to get more acclimated. And then now you're adding in the fact that they traded for DeAndre Hopkins, which is only going to help this offense. So Kenyon Drake is going to be put in plenty of scoring opportunities. He's someone who I absolutely love in the second round of drafts.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, I also seriously consider Drake. I'm really high on that entire Cardinals offense, honestly. I actually went with a much more maybe surprising pick in Aaron Jones. Jones is coming off a season where he scored second most fantasy points among running backs, and he proved to be extremely efficient, not only in the red zone where he led all running backs in touchdowns, but also between the 20s. Given that we don't have a preseason at all or a full off season, the rookie A.J. Dillon doesn't really figure to have much of a prominent role in the offense, at least this year. And Matt LaFleur last year began shifting a previously near 50-50 timeshare between Jamal Williams and Aaron Jones towards Jones as the season progressed. With the lack of a second fiddle to Devontae Adams in the receiving game, just yesterday we got news that Devin Funchess is not going to play. He was the de facto wide receiver 2. Jones definitely figures to get some significant work in the passing game as well. And I think that the combination of the guaranteed volume he'll get, as well as his efficiency with a career yards per carry of 5.0, should net a top 5 finisher. So even if the touchdowns get cut in half. So who's your third round pick?
Yeah, if I'm looking at the third round, a guy that jumps off the page, I mean, he's right inside the third round, but that's Allen Robinson in Chicago, wide receiver, currently going off the board as a wide receiver 10. He's someone who I have ranked ahead of that, a guy who finished with 98 receptions last season with Mitchell Trubisky. And if we're talking about the potential that Nick Foles steps into this offense and can captain it and can keep it afloat, where Trubisky struggled immensely last year, and Robinson still put up the numbers that he did. So I think Robinson is one of the most talented wide receivers in the NFL, and I think he's one of the most underrated. So for him to, and we've seen what he can do from a fantasy perspective. I think that's kind of his floor going into this season. So I really, really like him this year. I'm ecstatic that I can get him as my wide receiver 2, in some places, or even as my wide receiver 3 if I'm going to load up on wide receivers in the first few rounds, because people are letting him drop a little bit, even in drafts past this ADP. People just don't want the Bears offense, and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to take the guys that are dropping to me.
Yeah, definitely. How do you see that quarterback situation developing in the Bears? Do you see Foles being the longtime starter?
Yeah, so before the news that we didn't have a preseason, I was projecting Foles to be the 16-game starter. However, since that news, I have adjusted my projection model to be Trubisky starting the first 3 weeks and then Foles taking over after that. And even with that in mind, Robinson is still finishing as my wide receiver 7. So, or wide receiver 6, I think he's in that range. So yeah, this is a guy that I really, really like. And as far as that quarterback, yeah, I do expect Trubisky to start the season, but I expect Foles to step in eventually.
So for my pick right now, I'm going to go with Odell Beckham Jr. And Odell finished with his worst fantasy season when healthy in 2019, but it was still his 5th straight 1,000-yard season, excluding his injured 2017. The things that were responsible for his regression were, steep regression from Baker, number 1, but a weak offensive line and overall just an atmosphere of frustration stemming from poor coaching and the bad team culture. Well, gone is Freddie Kitchen now, who certainly held the offense back with his play calling, and it's hard to imagine Odell doing worse in 2020. Whereas Kevin Stefanski leads this offense is yet to be seen. But just to put things into perspective, if OBJ had scored the season average of around 10 touchdowns, he would have been the wide receiver 12 last season. That's exactly where he's projected this season. And signs point to more involvement, given that Jarvis Landry just had hip surgery this offseason. He may not be 100%. And for me, if a 1,035-yard season is the worst we've seen from this generational talent, I feel pretty good about snagging him this late in the third round. Yeah. So round 4 is where it gets a little more interesting. I think there was a lot of candidates that we were considering, a lot of good names. Who excites you in round 4?
Yeah, the guy, and I'm not sure if you had identified this guy, so forgive me if I took your guy, but it's Calvin Ridley for me. I think this guy is just in a prime position to finish as a wide receiver 1 this year. If you're getting him in the 4th round as the wide receiver 18 off the board currently in ADP consensus, man, that is just a steal. We talked about Chris Godwin last year emerging and being a candidate that we had identified. I was all in on Chris Godwin last year, and I'm all in on Calvin Ridley this year, especially when you factor in his draft costs. This offense is going to be passing the ball a ton. And you have Russell Gage there as the wide receiver 3, who is not going to see more than 4 to 5 targets per game. So if that's the case, then Calvin Ridley is going to see a ton of targets this season. And he's shown that he can score touchdowns with Matt Ryan there behind center. So he is someone who I am looking to get on all of my fantasy rosters.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm also extremely high on Calvin Ridley. I mean, we have to remember that Austin Hooper and all the targets associated with him are gone. I actually was torn between 2 Steelers, and I went with James Conner. In what I would consider somewhat an unexpected development, the Steelers actually publicly gave James Conner a vote of confidence prior to this season and mentioned that they expected him to be a workhorse running back and carry a pretty heavy load. He definitely has a concerning injury history, even dating back to his time in college, but when healthy, Conner's definitely a top 10 fantasy running back. Anthony McFarland, the rookie, might take up some third down work as a change of pace back, but Connor's definitely well ahead of Benny Snell and Jalen Samuels in the depth chart, both as a runner and a receiver. He was quite good as a receiver in his rookie year, actually. And I think he'll be good for about 15 or 20 touches a game. Lastly, of course, the offense will be buoyed by the return of Ben Roethlisberger, and that will probably present lighter boxes due to recognition of a more potent passing attack. So I think that'll help Connor a lot. So the fifth round definitely had a lot of household names and some names that really stood out from last season, as well as some, other players who consistently do well. So where do you end up going there?
Yeah, it's Robert Woods, and it's not even close. This is a guy who I'm looking at as a borderline wide receiver one this season. And he finished with 90 plus receptions last year, finished with over 1,000 yards in the from a receiving yards perspective, and then only finished with 2 receiving touchdowns. That is extremely low for someone who finished with those other totals. So that number should come up and regress to the mean this season. And if that's the case, Robert Woods is an easy candidate to finish as a wide receiver one. People are drafting Cooper Kupp, and I think those as a top 12 wide receiver, I think those 2 players should be flipped. Cooper Kupp saw his target totals go down immensely when the offense changed offensive philosophies there to running heavy 12 personnel, which is 1 running back, 2 tight ends on the field, which takes the slot receiver off the field. And Robert Woods is going to stay on the field as the X receiver. This is someone who is just going to see a ton of targets this year. He's someone who I absolutely love at that current draft price. I think he should be well above that.
Yeah, easy pick in round 5 for me as well. I also went Robert Woods. And just to kind of echo some of the things that you said and present some more stats, Cooper Kupp's ADP is late in the 3rd round at 35. And you would expect Woods' ADP to be at least around that vicinity, but instead it's late in the 5th at 57, which is the wide receiver 25 spot. I just think there's no way to justify that big of a gap between the dynamic Rams duo. And given that Woods only missed 1 game in that last 2 seasons, and like the shifting offensive philosophy that you mentioned, you could even make the argument to draft him around before Kupp. Woods having posted back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, and he's never relied on the red zone to get points. With a career high of just 6 touchdowns in a single season, fantasy owners can be pretty confident that Woods will be among the league leaders in receptions production, especially with Brandon Cooks gone now. Woods was the wide receiver 17 last season with 2 touchdowns. This is an easy pick in round 5 for me. Like you said, if Woods is around at this point, I take him easily. Okay, moving on to round 6. Which was your pick?
Yeah, it's a guy who's right on that edge there of round 5 and round 6. But David Montgomery, I'm going to go back to the Chicago Bears offense here because we're talking about a running back who's going to see 250 carries easy in this season. If he can stay healthy, he's got the workload. There is very little competition there for him. Tariq Cohen's obviously going to see some work on the ground, but he's not going to see more than 100 carries. Ryan Nall has never seen a significant workload or anything close to it. So David Montgomery is going to be the clear starter in this offense. And this offense should be much improved from what it was last year. David Montgomery put up solid numbers last year. It wasn't great, but it was still solid numbers. And even though he was incredibly hyped last year and he burned a lot of people, that's why his ADP is so low. He's someone who I'm willing to take at this spot because his ADP is so low. He's just going to produce. It's not going to be an RB1. I don't believe so. I think he's going to be a high-end RB2, though, and I have him ranked well above his ADP.
Yeah, definitely with Montgomery, you do get the guaranteed volume, but I do fear for the quarterback situation that leading to pretty stacked boxes for a 2nd year in a row. Really, Nick Foles outside of Philly has been a bottom tier quarterback. So I'd be interested to see if he is truly an upgrade over Mitch Trubisky and if that benefits the run game as well. I actually went with Michael Gallup. I really would not be surprised at all to see Michael Gallup replicate or even improve upon his 2019 production, despite the Cowboys drafting CeeDee Lamb in the 1st round. Jason Witten and Randall Cobb actually each took up 83 targets in the offense last year, and that sums up to 166 total targets. Also, Amari Cooper was dinged up for a large part of last season, but he still played all 16 games, which he rarely does. And assuming he misses his usual couple of games or even plays while dinged up, which he tends to do, Gallup suddenly primed to push for a wide receiver 2 finish, I would think, with so many targets being freed up, which would more than justify his ADP. So who do you end up going with in round 7? I know we've had a run of receivers.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's a guy that I think I will continue the run on wide receivers here. It's Tyler Boyd in Cincinnati, as we're looking at a player who performed extremely well last year. Excuse me, sorry. It performed extremely well last year with Andy Dalton and Ryan Finley at quarterback. Now you're getting a huge upgrade with Joe Burrow. And this offense is going to be much more dynamic than what it was in previous seasons, which presents more scoring opportunities. He's going to be the slot receiver. We saw what Joe Burrow did with slot receivers with Justin Jefferson at LSU this past season. So Tyler Boyd is an incredible wide receiver. He's immensely talented. And for him to be going as a wide receiver 33, I think he's going to drastically outperform that.
Yeah, and I'll add right on to that with my pick was also Boyd. And as the wide receiver 23 last season, as you mentioned, it's hard to justify him sliding down all the way to the wide receiver 33 spot. While it's certainly possible that he regresses from his strong 2019 season, it almost seemed foolish not to draft Boyd in the 7th round given the opportunity. He's off back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons and actually has a higher points per game with AJ Green on the field. So he's not hurt by these wide receivers. They actually complement his production. And a quick stat, Joe Burrow targeted Justin Jefferson, like you mentioned, a whopping 122 times last season. That's where he likes to go with the ball. That's good news for Boyd. Boyd is poised for another 25 finish in the wide receiver rankings. And just wrapping up here in the last couple of rounds here, here's where a good pick could definitely make a huge impact on your season, but almost seems tough here. Here's where I struggle to find some value. I'm interested to see what you were able to come up with in round 8.
Yeah, if we're looking at round 8, there aren't a ton of guys that I'm looking at. Like Will Fuller jumps off the page as someone who could explode, but obviously he has health concerns, so he's not someone who I'm necessarily all aboard on. But Damian Williams is the guy that I'll mention here, going in this range as the RB32. And this is primarily based on the report that we're not going to have a preseason. If that's the case, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is unlikely to step in as the starting running back immediately in Kansas City, which presents Damian Williams as a value. And I'll mention him because a lot of people are looking at those zero running back strategy this year and loading up on wide receivers early. If you are going to deploy that, Damian Williams is a perfect candidate for your RB2, your RB1 in some cases, because he's going to present value immediately in weeks, maybe 1 through 4, he's a starter, but then he's still going to be involved. And so Clyde Edwards-Helaire will take over this job eventually. Damian Williams has got it locked up for the first month or so.
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, Williams is coming off a monster playoff run and really should have been the Super Bowl MVP, in my opinion. He got to be high on really everyone that Chiefs offense. But for me, actually, my pick for this round was a pretty clear one. It's Brandon Cooks. I know you mentioned Will Fuller, but I think Cooks goes into that de facto wide receiver 1 role for Deshaun Watson and the Texans. Not many people know that since his injury-shortened rookie year in 2014, despite having a huge injury-prone label, Brandon Cooks has only missed 2 games, and they were both last year as a result of concussion. Now, I know he left a few more early also because of concussions, and that generally is pretty concerning, but every time Brandon Cooks has played a full season, which has been 4 full seasons, 2015 to 18, he's finished as a top 14 wide receiver. And I really think that someone will have to replicate a large portion of the production that DeAndre Hopkins had. And even DeAndre Hopkins had a bit of a down season last year, but was still a clear top 5 fantasy receiving option. So I definitely think that Cooks should continue this trend of finishing as a borderline wide receiver 1 if he plays full season. Now, of course, that depends on whether he can stay healthy, but I'm overall optimistic, and much more so than Will Fuller, whose ADP is actually 1 wide receiver spot above Cooks. So who did you end up going with for round 9?
Yeah, if we're in round 9 now, we're looking at guys who have the potential to either blow up, huge upside picks, or guys who are going to get guaranteed workloads. And if we're looking at guaranteed workloads, Jordan Howard sitting here in the 9th round is very bizarre to me why he's still here on the board. Howard is a lock for 220 carries in this offense. He's a very, very talented running back. I think he's one of the most underrated running backs in the NFL. And if he's sitting here in the 9th round and you can get him as your RB4, RB5 in some cases, I think that is a fantastic pick. I don't think he has the immense upside, that some of these other guys do, but to get him here is a very, very good pick.
Just a quick question. Are you higher on Howard or Matt Breida going into next year? Who do you think is going to get most of the carries?
Sure. Yeah, I'm definitely higher on Jordan Howard. Matt Breida has never seen more than 150 carries in a season, and he is someone who's a change of pace back. So I expect him to be kind of this guy that they utilize on third down, and he'll be the pass catching complement there, which he excels in. But then Jordan Howard will be the guy who will receive the majority of the carries.
So speaking of volume and guarantee, the guy I go with here is someone who's not necessarily just necessarily going to be able to pick up that volume. And I would flag it as almost a little bit of a risk, but Phil Lindsay is someone that experienced much too big of a drop for me from 2019. Going from the RB19 to the RB39, what has changed? If you just look at Melvin Gordon, he's a big name in fantasy 2 years ago, but with his health history, is ultimately a bit of a question mark heading into 2020. This will certainly crowd the backfield, and suddenly Denver has one of the league's best rushing trios. But before people write off Lindsay, if you look at his career trajectory, he joined the league in 2018 and exploded for a 1,000-yard rushing season. And despite constant talks of Royce Freeman becoming the lead back in Denver entering 2019, Lindsay only increased his volume and finished with yet another 1,000-yard season. So is there reason to expect regression with Gordon in the picture? Definitely. But the running back 39, if Lindsay is still around in the ninth round, I'd probably take him. And we could see something as a similar Eckler to Gordon type of compliment in Denver, which would more than justify a ninth round flyer. And then now we're really getting to the bottom here. And so round 10 is sometimes the round I feel that this could be a difference maker looking at a couple of these names. Who do you have your eyes set on?
Sure. Yeah. So Hayden Hurst is a guy who I'm going to mention here in this range because of his ability in this offense. He is, he's an older tight end at this point. He was drafted in the first round by Baltimore and wasn't utilized primarily because they found someone like Mark Andrews later on in the draft. And he's obviously been phenomenal. But Hayden Hurst is still a very talented tight end. And so he's now stepping into a role in this Atlanta offense, which I mentioned earlier with Calvin Ridley, that is just going to be very high powered, very pass happy, and he's going to see all the targets he can handle. We saw Austin Hooper be the tight end 1 for the majority of last year in this offense. And I think Hayden Hurst is not much of a drop off there. So I think, I'm not projecting a tight end 1, or anything like that, as far the tight end 1, but I think I have him currently projected as the tight end 5 on the season. So for him to be all the way down here and drafted as the tight end 13 in ADP, I think he needs to be going much, much higher than that.
Yeah, definitely. I actually, when you mentioned he was an older tight end, I just looked and realized he was drafted when he was 25 years old. That's a little surprising. But anyways, I went with Tevin Coleman here. Now, Coleman was definitely thoroughly outplayed by Raheem Mostert for large parts of 2019. But overall, his volume was actually quite comparable, and he got his fair share of goal line work as well. Going back to his days with Kyle Shanahan in Atlanta, Coleman's proven that he can be a really efficient 1B running back with RB3 value and RB2 upside. Devontae Freeman had a season where I believe he was the top scoring running back in fantasy football, and Coleman definitely presented consistent RB3 value throughout that season. With Matt Breida gone and Raheem Mostert generally uninvolved in the passing game, and Jerick McKinnon not really being a lock to make the roster, I definitely think that Coleman should have his fair share of volume in the passing game, in addition to probably 40% of the carries or so. And overall, I would say similar opportunity to Raheem Mostert. So I don't think it makes much sense to have Coleman's ADP be several rounds below that of Mostert. So it looks like we have time to go into an 11th round here. Now, in my opinion, the players in this round were definitely quite uninspiring, and there were only 2 I seriously consider, but who do you end up going with?
Sure. Yeah, there's 2 guys that I've got my eye on too. So Latavius Murray is the guy that I'll highlight here as a player who last year we didn't see him do much except for when Alvin Kamara went down and he would put up ridiculous numbers. However, previously in New Orleans, the running back duos there have both been extremely relevant for fantasy football. We saw Alvin Kamara, his production take a dip last season, and I think that directly affected the rushing game. And then, of course, having Drew Brees miss time didn't help either. So Latavius Murray at RB45, he possesses standalone value, that you can roll in as an RB2, RB3, potentially into your flex in some matchups. But then he carries immense upside if something were to happen to Alvin Kamara, like we saw last year. Kamara misses time with injury or anything like that, Latavius Murray could be in the RB1 conversation, and that is something that I absolutely want to take with these later round guys that can be dart throws. So, yeah, huge upside there.
Definitely think that can be justified. I'm wondering if you think Latavius would be startable if Kamara were healthy on a week-to-week basis. Would you fly him as a flex in certain weeks given the proper matchup, or is it dependent on some sort of situational event?
Sure. Yeah. No. Like I said, I think he can be this guy that you can roll in as an RB, 3 and someone into your flex in these matchups where you know that it's going to be high powered, a potential shootout somewhere that there's going to be scoring opportunities here. So I don't think that where you're drafting him, you don't need to, right? You don't need to start him in your flex, but yet he can carry that upside or that potential where you can roll him in, and especially in a season where we don't know if your fifth round running back or fourth round running back that you selected here in this draft is going to miss time for 3 weeks because he misses because he gets into quarantine, right? He gets put into quarantine. At that case, I want a guy like Latavius Murray that I can roll into my lineup.
I definitely can see the value in certain guys who would otherwise be seen as handcuffs in this round. This round was tough for me. Of these 12 options, 4 are defenses and kickers. But my choice here is second-year receiver Mecole Hardman, who only had about a 30% snap share in 2019. This guy's a weekly threat to give your team an extra 6 via special teams. Hardman was a rookie wide receiver that managed a respectable 538 yards and 6 touchdowns in a loaded Chiefs offense. And if you consider the fact that Tyreek Hill and Sammy Watkins aren't exactly locks to play all 16 games, Hardman can only benefit heading into next season as he continues to develop his connection with Mahomes, still a very raw player at this point, and he boasts great efficiency when he's on the field. I wouldn't count on the young speedster being a week-to-week start by any means, but I expect him to jump to Demarcus Robinson on the depth chart eventually, and I'd be pretty happy if I got him at the 125th pick, which is where he is right now.
Yeah, definitely. I love Hardman as well. I was wondering, Mr. Yates, since I know you're actually a Bears fan, what are your thoughts on Tariq Cohen for next year?
Yeah, he was the guy that I was actually considering mentioning there alongside Latavius Murray. So I have Cohen rated much higher than his current ADP and ECR. So he's someone that I identified as his efficiency, my goodness, should bounce back from what we saw last season. And he's going to be a value. I think a lot of people are out on him based on he finishes the RB13 in 2018 and was being drafted, with high expectations for last year. He obviously hurt a ton of people. So I don't think his draft cost is going to rise much, but he's someone that I'm taking pretty much everywhere I can get.
Oh yeah. I mean, his efficiency last year was like terrible. I mean, I definitely am pretty high on him relative to last year, even if he doesn't go back to a borderline RB1 like he was 2 years ago. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. We've done 11 rounds, 11 players each, both from starting 11 from FantasyPros. So let us know in the comments who you think is the best value player in this year's draft.
Yeah, definitely a special shout out to Kyle and FantasyPros for joining us today. Be sure to check out some of their work. We'll definitely link it in the description below.
All right. See you next time.
Thank you very much, guys.
Okay.